It was about late November in Colorado, and I was about 7 or 8, and my father got the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin that he was going to rent. My mother thought it was a great idea for me, my sister, and my father and my mother to bond. So that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days. We took school off on Friday to get a head start getting there, which I absolutely had no issue with. We got there and it was sure cold. Well, it was almost December, so I guess it made sense that it was that cold. Anyways, we got all set up and decided where we would sleep. We ate dinner and then we got all set up for bed, and we were just thinking about what we would do tomorrow. We got there kind of late, so we couldn't do much on the first day. That first night though, I heard noises outside. It sounded kind of like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it must have been an animal. I just tried to get back to sleep, but about 15 minutes later I heard it again. I woke my sister up, which she was about 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something out there. We weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it'd be best for us to not see us, so we went back to sleep. I had a hard time sleeping that night, and so did my sister. When we eventually woke up, my mother was inside making breakfast and my father was outside. I asked my mom if I could go outside with my dad, and she told me sure, while my sister stayed inside and waited for my mother to finish breakfast. I walked outside and my father was talking to some man, a short, chubby man. He had a shaved head and was wearing a veteran cap. He looked really nervous too, for some reason. He was sweating a lot, even though it was freezing outside. I walked over to him and my father, and my dad looked at me and said, "Oh, this is my son," and told him my name. The man then looked at me and said, "Hey, nice to meet you, kid. My name's Patrick." He just smiled and looked at me. I also smiled and greeted him back, and maybe it was rude at the time, but I was just a kid, so I asked him, "You look kind of scared. Are you alright?" And he kind of coughed and replied with, "Oh yeah, I'm fine. I just went through shell shock because I'm a veteran," as I couldn't tell already with the cap that he was wearing, but he seemed normal then. My father seemed to really like this guy for some reason, and I guess at first I liked him too. He told my father he had also rented a cabin with his family and that they were really close to us, so he decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast and he stayed, and everything was normal. I went outside to play after that with my father and Patrick. While playing outside, I fell and scraped my knee and started crying. My dad was inside at the time, which was a bad time for him to be inside. My mother was calling for him, and he ran inside while I was out there with Patrick. Patrick then ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I agreed and I went with him. I wasn't a very smart kid. We talked about what I liked doing, and I told him about the video games that I played and stuff like that. Then things got weird. He asked me what shoe size I was and how old I am. Didn't know my shoe size, so I told him that, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something along the lines of, "Good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was way back, at least 20 minutes to walk there. I was tired and there was no point in getting the bandit anymore, but I still decided to keep going since I had walked too long. We entered the cabin and he told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something. There was nobody in there. No family. I asked him where his family was and he didn't answer, pretending like he didn't hear me. He then locked the door. I was starting to feel frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo." He then walked into the kitchen and pulled one out of somewhere, and then walked back and told me to have a seat and that he'd put it on. I sat down and he put it on me. He also held my leg with his other hand and rubbed up and down and told me, "You're rather muscular, kid. I like that." I kind of got scared and I immediately stood up. He asked me what was wrong and I told him nothing and that my leg was feeling much better. I then said that I thought my parents would be worried sick about me and that I should hurry back, but he insisted that I stayed a little longer and ate there. I really didn't want to, but I was alone, and if I ran, I don't think I could find my way back to the cabin. The door was locked too, so I just agreed and decided to eat with him and get it over with fast. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed about 70 pounds. He then had a smile go across his face. He nodded and said, "Perfect weight." I asked him what that meant, and he just kept smiling at me. I was really weirded out when I asked him if I could go. He told me no and that things were just getting started and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. He had such a weird tone when he said that too. I then heard a big bang come from the bedroom. It was a closed door. Patrick stood up and looked kind of angry. He walked into the room and shut the door behind him, and I heard him yelling, "Did I tell you that you could move? No, stay where you are, I have company," or something like that. He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly. "Sorry about that, that was just my wife. She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today." He was smiling while saying that also. I really wanted to go, and I looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere. It was really messy. He must have been living out of here. That moment, his wife walked out of the room. "I'm hungry," she said. At this point, the man looked pissed. That's when he yelled, "Get back in there." His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffing and had red circles around her eyes. She looked at me, then walked back in the room. I asked him where his kids were, and he didn't answer. He told me that he had kids' clothes that he wanted me to try on, and that was the last straw for me. I had to get out of that situation, and I didn't know how. I started crying, and then he hugged me. He told me it'll be okay, that nothing is going to happen, and to just try on the clothes. He walked in the back room, and I thought this would be the perfect time for me to leave. I unlocked his door, and I tried to leave as quietly as I could. I didn't even care if I got lost anymore. I just didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick, if that was even his name. I had a feeling that he had been lying. I mean, he lied about having kids, so who knows what else. I was in the woods trying to find my way back. I was still close to his house, close enough to hear his shouting. I heard him yelling stuff to his wife, things along the lines of, "Where the hell did he go? And I knew I shouldn't have left him alone. You probably let him leave." I could have sworn I heard him call her a few nasty names a couple times. Then it happened. I stopped in my tracks. I heard footsteps. I went and hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. And there he was, standing outside, and he seemed to be looking for me. I was far enough away to where I could barely see him, but I could tell he was looking for me. He then stepped out in the forest, and I heard him shouting, "Hey kid, it's okay, you can come back now. You don't have to try on the clothes. And I have toys back in my cabin, all you have to do is come back." I then started running. I just ran as fast as I could in a straight line in hopes to find somebody in my family. I was running away and I thought I heard shouting, but I didn't stop to hear it. Then after about an hour of running, I finally saw a cabin. It was my cabin. I ran to it. My father was outside looking around for me. I ran up to him crying and told him Patrick wasn't a good guy and that he was really weird and how he was touching my legs and stuff. My father immediately called the person he rented the cabin from. My father looked at me and told me to never follow any stranger ever again. We immediately left that day and asked for a refund the next day. The guy renting them out apologized. The man that owned the cabin rentals called the police and they went back there and checked the cabin and there was nobody back there, not even his wife. His clothes and belongings were still there is what they told us, but nothing really happened after that. They asked questions and left, and they never called us or told us anything about him ever again. Patrick most likely wasn't his real name, and he probably wasn't a veteran. I just want to know what happened to him and his wife, and how he even got a wife in the first place, and how and why he lived back in that cabin. He seemed to have lived there for a while. I guess he left because he figured the police would be coming after him since he didn't rent the cabin. So many questions that will never get answered. My friend Lily has a cabin on a lake in Washington, and one summer she brought me and her cousin Evan. It had been a great couple of days, and on the last night, like we had the past few nights, we went fishing at the lake, which was only a 5-minute walk from her cabin. It was around 7 p.m., and fishing was perfect at that hour. To get to the beach, though, you had to walk through a small section of woods. There was a trail in the middle that during the day was occupied by women jogging with strollers and kids running to another nearby beach. Our beach was a bit more secluded, and there was no trail to get there. The hill down was steep and slippery, and on the way back, it took climbing on all fours to get to the top. We stayed at that beach until about 8:30, just sitting in the dark relaxing. We were pretty good kids and mostly just sat on a log chatting. It was one of those weird situations where you suddenly look around and you realize that it has gotten dark. I told Lily and Evan that we should probably get home. They agreed and we packed up our gear. This was the latest that we had stayed out at the beach, so my overactive and scary movie-powered imagination, I was a little bit scared. We calmly and silently for some reason walked up the hill. I told him that it was pretty creepy here at night, and then Evan made it 10 times worse. He told us a story about these mountain men who had been around in the 60s and were basically these men who lived in the woods and were in some sort of cult. He said that they had murdered people all over the area for their cult and that some of them were still around. Internally, I was hysterical and terrified, but externally, I basically told Evan to shut up and to stop trying to scare us. As we started across the trail, Evan looked to our right for some reason. He stopped dead in his tracks and looked scared. Lily told him to stop being stupid, and the two of us started to climb the steepest part, the all-force climbing part of the hill. Evan grabbed us both by the arm very forcefully and made us look where he was looking. At first I couldn't see anything and I just wanted to get home. But then my eyes adjusted and I saw a large man. I'm assuming he was a man because of the shape, stumbling toward us pretty slowly. Who knows what his intentions were, but being kids, we freaked out and scrambled up the hill as fast as we could. We all turned around at some point and saw that the dude was running. Well, stumbling quicker toward us while we climbed. He got pretty close to us until we finally got over the hill and sprinted across the road to the cabin. At first it sounds fairly innocent, but we all had a deep feeling of dread when we saw him on that trail. I didn't feel like he had good intentions. Once we got to the cabin, we threw our gear on the porch and ran to the front door, and of course it was locked. But there was a secret knock that her family had showed that the person at the door was a member of the family or a friend. It was a fairly complicated rhythm, and both Lily and Evan banged on the door to the family knock. I remember just looking around trying to see if the creep had followed us, but I saw nothing. We were let in, and in a panic we told the adults the whole story. They said it was probably just some guy who we probably made feel bad. We disagreed, but we felt safe in the locked cabin with the grown-ups. The cabin had a walkout basement, basically like a lower story. Not a creepy basement. It had a door and windows, where Lily and I slept on bunk beds. We went down to get into pajamas. After about 5 minutes of calming down together, we heard the family knock. I thought it was Evan trying to come in from the stairway door, so I said, "Come in," but no response. It happened again, but this time we realized where it was coming from. The window outside. Lily and I turned completely white and stared at each other with that horrible feeling of terror in your stomach. It happened again, but a little more frantically. We both ran to the stairway door and booked it up to the living room where Lily's family and Evan were. We told them all what we had heard through the panicked tears, and Evan went downstairs to listen. He said it was definitely the knock. While Lily's uncle, older brother, and older cousin all gathered flashlights to go look outside, we heard it again, but on the front door this time. Everyone looked at the door and huddled together. It happened once or twice more, and Lily's uncle finally decided to call the police. He said, "I'm not sure what their intentions are, but there is someone trying to get into my cabin," to the police. The knocking went on for another 2 minutes or so, and finally it stopped. 5 minutes after the call, the police showed up with a comforting loud pounding, and "police" yelled through the door. To make sure, Lily's uncle looked outside a window and saw other police searching around for the creeper. The policeman asked us 3 kids what had happened in the woods, and we told him the whole thing. They never found anyone, but those banging knocks on the door will stick with me forever. The officer said that it was probably just some guy who was twisted and wanted to freak some kids out. But what creeped me out the most was the fact that the person had memorized a complicated family knock. All 3 of us slept on the floor together that night. I was 11 when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made great money on his jobs, but because he was so heavily in debt, at least 500 plus, and my mom was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget, we never had much free money available. This meant that we went on a vacation once every few years, and usually that was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a new movie. Final Destination, because my dad loved watching scary stuff and scaring the daylights out of my sisters and me. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it and came back to grab Mom while we kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently the client he had been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and had offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so Mom went into a panic frenzy of packing, so we didn't get to see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2.5-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and we went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook thing you could climb up to that was about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the three of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on the rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one, and Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last room, which had a queen-size bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed without a curtain, and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked and we couldn't get in it for some reason. I never did find out what was in there. We went to bed at around 11 o'clock. Belle can be a kicker in her sleep, so I slept by the lamp in case she ended up knocking it over. I remember lying down, and I must have instantly fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up and looked towards her and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process that, and then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Belle with me. We rushed to our parents, who told us we were imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed, and if we saw anything else to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them and went back in the room with Belle. We switched positions because she refused to go back to bed by the window. I told her a story to get her to sleep, and I promptly knocked myself out after her. I didn't wake up until morning. The next day we went exploring around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we spend the day in the town. They had a lot of small shops, and my parents went to every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in the town, and finally we went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remember everybody laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everyone stop. He took another step towards the cabin and then pushed the door open with a single finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but I didn't put the obvious together right away. "Dad?" Ariel shuffled nearer to Belle and me, but my dad gave his head a shake to let her know she needed to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two while we stood on the porch. Mom called out his name and he called back that we could come inside. We did, and we found him standing in the middle of the living room with a frown. He locked the door once we were all inside and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick chat. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Belle and me by suggesting another round of the board game that we had been playing the night before. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad came back. Mom went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast while Dad joined our game. We played for a few hours and Dad told us we needed to go to bed. It was only 9 at that point, which made Ariel kind of mad. She was usually allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and even later on weekends and vacation. Belle and I went on to bed while they argued. We climbed back into the same spots we slept in, with Belle by the window and me by the lamp. I read to her for a bit before we drifted off. I woke up to Dad rushing in our room. He scooped Belle out of the bed and grabbed my hand. He dragged me out of the room and into the hall, where I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by my mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine in the living room, and I saw our dog sitting by the back door. She was bristled and seemed anxious. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand. They rushed out of the house and into the van. Dad went back to get our dog, and then he burned rubber getting out of the cabin. He drove all the way back home without talking once. It took a half hour for Duchess to finally calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Belle and I didn't find out until years later. He'd woken up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window in his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on, and he had found that the front door was unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl at the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got us out of the house. He went back the next day to get our luggage and found several pairs of footprints outside Belle's and my window. This is a true story. Every time I tell it, it pulls the eyes of everyone in the room. So in the summer of 2020, my friends Alex and Violet and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard, and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountainous estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet brought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in her bag as we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin. I remember the knot in the pit of my stomach, like this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid this night. Violet was pretty angry. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled towards the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites, just a long winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road. Then we saw the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, and climbed the fire tower and left. We had heard previously that there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside. Eated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and we sat in silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to the white noise, living in the city, because there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. But here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of your own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, and finally I had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, then I slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen up, and we were laughing, finally having the fun time that we'd envisioned. Much soberer than we thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd recall hearing noises in the background, the snap of a twig, or the dim rumble of an engine. None of us really wanted to rupture the air of the nonchalance between us, so we ignored it. Until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it like 3 times. We were all screaming in an instant, and Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them around, and Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, or whatever this was, would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived about 20 minutes later, which was a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing, though. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids, rather than the one closest to the pan that we used to cook? And also, why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they come across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life that they had seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they had said, and dizzied by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places that we hadn't. We grabbed all of our stuff by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, and we were grateful for every pothole that found us further and further from the wretched cabin. I couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top. No pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late night excursion. But the kids from earlier, we had seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way, because they didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence and secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare, because they had planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me, and I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service, because it's certainly been a welcome surprise to us. A couple years ago, my friend Kate had asked me to go with her to a party. This party was being thrown by her friend Susan. So Kate had gone to a Catholic school with her in elementary and middle school, but during high school, Kate ended up going to a public school where she met me, while Susan went to a Catholic high school. The two had grown apart somewhat and hung out with different people, which is why Kate invited me along. It was Susan's birthday, and apparently Susan's parents had decided to rent out a cabin for her. They did this for the previous year, and unbeknownst to them, she had decided to throw a party. The party had been a hit last time, so she was planning on doing it again. Kate and I drove to the cabin together, and it was pretty isolated. Aside from the woods behind it, there wasn't anything around. We couldn't even see the other cabins, but I imagined they would probably be empty because it was wintertime. At first I was a little apprehensive because I wasn't going to know anyone at the party, but I figured after a few drinks that wouldn't really bother me anymore. Also, if you watch scary movies, you know that having a party in a cabin in the woods is a horror movie cliche. I was very aware of that. Kate and I had even been joking about how attending this party sounded like a prelude to a horror film. As if that wasn't enough, this was a Catholic schoolgirl party. We arrive at the cabin and it is pitch black outside. We needed to use our phones just to find our way. We go inside and everything seems fine, and the birthday girl is having a great time, and there was a good amount of people. The odd thing is that there seems to be a strange sort of divide at the party. Kate and I were completely unaware of what was happening. I did happen to know this guy though, who had the name of the city we lived in tattooed in a messy scrawl across his neck. Kate and I had been silently laughing about it, but we were also a little worried because we wondered if that meant he was in a gang or something. Anyways, I don't remember why, but the main group of the party wanted these people to leave. I think it had to do with them drinking a lot, despite not having brought any alcohol of their own. So in order to get these people to go, the main group said that a ranger, or whoever, was coming to stop by here, and that there was only supposed to be like 2 cars by the cabin, and a handful of people. Rumor was that one of the guys in the group was on probation and couldn't afford to get in trouble, so they left. The plan was a success. Or so we thought. Just as the group leaves, there were about 4 or 5 guys and 1 girl. The girl comes back in and says, "I just want to tell the birthday girl happy birthday," in a really loud voice, drawing everyone's attention. Everyone was staring at her in confusion. Like, why was she announcing this so awkwardly? When, not even 2 seconds later, you hear a window in one of the back rooms being busted open. This continues on, and more windows are being broken, and people are shouting and screaming. I'm just sitting there in confusion. Kate and I had been at this party for all of 15 minutes before all hell broke loose. And the girl who invited the group of hoodlums is now saying that she knows at least one of them has a gun. I don't know if my mind wasn't processing all of this correctly or what, but I'm just sitting there thinking, well, this is happening. The majority of us remained in the cabin. A couple of people went outside to see if the group was still there, and after a little bit of time had passed, people began to leave. There was still some fear that those guys might be out there waiting, but a lot of people just wanted to get out. I remember 3 girls who had been planning on staying the night had gathered all their stuff up with their arms full and began heading out the door. As soon as all 3 walk out, we hear screaming coming from the woods, and all 3 girls immediately turn around and walk right back in. In retrospect, it was kind of funny. One of the girls proceeds to start crying though. Luckily, the scream had only been that of a new girl arriving at the party. She had seen her friend outside and had screamed in excitement. Kate and I had stayed at the cabin for a couple more hours. We really didn't want to leave Susan alone, and the majority of people had left at this point. Aside from us, there were only a couple of people left in the cabin. Thankfully, those people were staying the night, so Kate and I were able to leave around 2 a.m. We had all debated calling the cops, but considering the underage drinking going on, no one really wanted to. Plus, Susan was worried about her parents finding out about the party and had decided she was just going to lie about how the windows had been broken. Thankfully, the group of people, potential gangsters, did not return. While that night had been scary, all I can really focus on was the fact that this took place at a cabin in the middle of the woods, at a party thrown by Catholic schoolgirls.
I live in a neighborhood home with my older sister. We rent the place and split the bills. This was last October, as the weather was just starting to get colder. My sister had plans to meet up with some friends in Florida, so she would be gone for almost a whole week. She invited me, but I couldn't take the time off work. Anyway, she left on Monday morning, which was a day I didn't work. I cleaned up the house and just enjoyed having some time alone. That same day though, around 2, there was a knock at the door. I thought it was maybe a package my sister had ordered, so I answered it. It was an older man, like early 40s. He wasn't holding a package or anything though. "Hi, how can I help you?" The man looked me in the eyes for an unsettling amount of time before answering. "Oh, I just wanted to see who lived here. Sorry, didn't mean to bother you." He smiled and nodded, then walked away. I thought that was strange and wasn't really sure what he meant by that, but I closed the door and continued my day. As far as I'm aware, nothing else happened for the rest of the evening. The following day I had work, so I woke up early and headed down to the office. I got back home at 6. Only a half hour later, and while I was cooking dinner, there was a knock at the door again. I looked out the peephole before answering this time, and it was the same man from yesterday. He was easy to recognize because he wore the same exact clothes. I opened the door, though I was a bit more hesitant this time, only cracking it open. "Is everything okay?" He smiled and said of course, as if I was being silly for asking that. He then said he was just checking in on me. The way he said it was like it was expected or something. "Oh, are you a neighbor of mine? I didn't know," I said, assuming he must be one of those older nosy neighbors. It still would be strange for him to check in on me, but it would explain it. "Oh, no, I was just walking around," he said. He was really starting to creep me out now, so I said I was fine and closed the door. I waited for him to leave my porch, then went back to cooking. I texted my sister that night, asking if she'd ever encountered that man, but she said no. I was paranoid the rest of the night. I felt safe inside my home. All the doors were locked and everything, but I also felt like I was being stalked and watched. What could that man possibly want that wasn't something creepy? The night passed again, with no more signs of him, and same with the following day. He didn't knock on the door, and I had hoped it might actually be nothing to worry about. The day after, I had off work, and it was the last day that my sister would be gone for. I spent most of my time inside and just hanging out, reading and watching YouTube. Every so often, I'd peek out the windows just to be cautious, but I never saw anything. Around 8, I was watching TV when I heard something scrape against the outside of the house. It sounded like a stick scratching along the siding. I quickly got up and opened the blinds, seeing the bush right under the window shaking, and faintly, I could hear footsteps running away. I couldn't see anything else in the dark though. I felt like I was going to throw up. Surely it was the same man, but how long was he there? Was he sitting in the bushes, trying to watch me through the window? I was so out of it, I didn't know what to do and ended up calling my sister. Luckily for me, she picked up. I tried to explain to her what was going on, but I think I was talking too fast for her to understand. And midway through the conversation, there was a knock at the door. I didn't answer, but the man started calling out and knocking louder. He asked me to let him in and tried to guilt trip me by saying he was injured. Then he made excuses for being outside my home and then started apologizing for everything. He continued to bang on the door. It was creepy and disturbing how desperate he was for me to open the door. Clearly, something was wrong with him. My sister told me to call 911 immediately, so I hung up and did as she said. The man stayed at the door for a whole 5 minutes, still trying to convince me to let him in, before he finally left. What the man actually wanted is unknown, and how long he was stalking me for is also unknown. He could have somehow figured out my sister was gone for the week. It just seems like too big of a coincidence. Whatever the case, I haven't seen him at all since then. Hopefully, it's over. It was just before 2 a.m., and I had gotten an Uber back to my place after partying all night for New Year's. I don't think I was plastered or anything, but I definitely was well beyond tipsy, and I had a raging headache. When I got dropped off, I slowly made my way up to the front door and fumbled around with my keys for way too long before making it inside. I tossed everything on the floor and took an ibuprofen, then fell over on the couch. I was exhausted and tired, but the headache was keeping me from sleeping, so I kind of just laid there with my eyes closed for a while. I honestly have no idea how long. Randomly, though, the doorbell rang. It rang several times, and I never got up to answer the door, or even see who it was. At the moment, I didn't even care or think about it. I just wanted to lay there and try to sleep and not be bothered. Obviously, with it being the middle of the night, someone ringing my doorbell repeatedly should be pretty concerning. But like I said, I had a bit too much to drink. Surprisingly, not too long after they stopped ringing the doorbell, I actually managed to pass out on the couch. I couldn't say how long I was asleep for, but when I woke up, I was very groggy and felt weak, still with a pounding headache, and the whole house was dark. I stood up and tried to make my way to the kitchen to get a glass of water, when I noticed a streak of light on the wall in the hallway. Even in my not-so-sober state, it was unmistakable what it was. The light was coming from the front door being partially open and moonlight spilling into the house. Was I really so drunk that I didn't close the door? There was no way. Before I could even walk into the hallway and look at the door, footsteps moved around upstairs. I froze, then hurried back to the couch and ducked behind it. There were 2 sets of footsteps walking right above me. I thought about making a run for it, but my hesitation ruined my chances as the footsteps began making their way down the stairs. There was a pause, then the sound of the front door shutting, and the streak of light disappeared. "All right, let's get on with it." A man spoke. I was completely sobered up now, and realized they probably had just gotten inside moments before I woke up, and immediately checked the bedrooms upstairs. Not seeing anyone, they assumed the place was empty. My chest felt like it was burning from how fast my heart was racing. The men moved around in the room on the other side of the house and began chatting, like everyday regular talk about life. I don't know, but something about it was so disturbing and terrifying. I mean, if they were so comfortable breaking into my home and having casual conversations while doing so, Then what the hell were they going to do if they found me? I could hear them taking things, robbing all the rooms in the house, before the footsteps made their way into the living room. The way I had it set up, the couch was diagonal in the corner, so I was kind of closed off behind it, but the couch was also short, so if they got close to it, they would easily be able to see me. I just listened as they walked around, moving things and opening every drawer and box they saw. Then one of the men started walking closer to the couch. I hoped and waited for their footsteps to stop or change directions, but they kept coming closer and closer until I saw their head show above me. They were looking down at the cushions though, and I guess they didn't see me in the side of their vision. Then they moved on to the next room. I sat there motionless for almost 30 minutes, listening to them rummage through the entire house before they finally left. I didn't hear them say anything about coming back, but I grabbed my phone and ducked back behind the couch as I called the cops. The situation is mostly exactly what it seemed like. The men came in and robbed the valuables from my home. I had forgotten to lock the front door, but there's some evidence that it wouldn't have mattered. A neighbor said they saw two men watching my house rather suspiciously over the course of the past week. Likely they saw that I lived alone and always parked in the driveway, so when I took my car to the New Year's party and came back in an Uber without my car, they thought I wasn't home. Thankfully, it seems they only intended to rob me and nothing more, but had they found me, who knows what could have happened. I was at home with my dog Hazel. It was a normal night. I'd gotten out of work already and was just trying to enjoy the few hours I had before bed. I was watching TV and eating some snacks when Hazel got up and went to the back door, wanting to be let out. I got up and let her outside to do her business. I had a pretty small fenced-in backyard, so I never really needed to keep an eye on her too much. Usually she'd stay out for a while and sniff around anyway. While I was up, I put some dishes away and cleaned up the mess I made from cooking earlier, when Hazel started barking. She liked to bark at squirrels and stuff, but after a few seconds, she still hadn't let up. I walked over to the back door and opened it, seeing Hazel standing by the side of the fence and barking at it, like something was on the other side. It was just woods on that side of the fence, so I thought maybe she'd seen a coyote or something. Just to be safe, I called her back inside. I got back on the couch and turned the TV on. Something was immediately different about Hazel though. Usually she'd lay on or next to me, but she was sitting on the edge of the couch, head perked up and staring at the back door. No matter how much I'd call her over, she'd just glance at me, then go back to watching. She was like this for the rest of the night. A couple times I did look over there, but saw nothing. I thought she was just in protective mode for some reason, which she does randomly sometimes. We stayed up for a bit, then went to bed at 10:30. Hazel usually sleeps on the end of my bed, or on her doggy bed in the corner of the room, but I always leave the bedroom door cracked open because her food and water is downstairs. When I woke up in the middle of the night, I noticed the bedroom door was wide open, much more than I had left it. Maybe she bumped into the door. She wasn't in the room, and I didn't hear her nails clicking on the wooden floor, or the sound of her eating or drinking. On any other day, I'd probably just go back to sleep and not worry about it, but something gave me a bad gut feeling. Even my body seemed to have fully woken up already. I got out of bed and looked out into the hallway. The house was quiet. Hazel? I walked down the steps and into the living room. Everything seemed to be normal, but all the food and water in her bowls were still full. At this point, everything was rushing through my mind. I was scared maybe somehow I'd left the back door open and she ran away or something, even though I knew I didn't. I walked into the kitchen and my heart sank, seeing Hazel crouched underneath the table, shivering and shaking, and staring at me, completely terrified of something. I called her name again, and she didn't move, and then I noticed the back door was open. Everything was starting to come together in my mind, but I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped and scared and vulnerable. I hurried over to the table and picked Hazel up, then ran right out the back door. I left through the fence gate and ran over to a neighbor's house. It took a minute, but eventually they woke up and answered the door, calling the police for me. When officers searched my home, they didn't find anyone. There were a few signs of shoe prints around the house though, some even being upstairs. That whole scenario is so confusing and left me with hundreds of questions and zero answers. I don't know who it was, or why they broke in, or even how long they'd been inside for. Were they the one to open my bedroom door all the way? Were they hiding when I was looking for Hazel? Were they even still in the house? I almost wish I encountered them before running away, so I'd at least have some sort of answers. Now I'm left with nothing. I just have to live and hope it was some random thing and that they don't come back.
During spring break of my senior year of high school, I went on a trip to the beach with my group of friends. My best friend, Tyler, went too. His dad just bought a condo right on the beach, but he hadn't set it up to rent it out yet, so he let us party in it for a few days, as long as we didn't wreck the place. Nothing sounded better than multiple nights of living completely carefree and hanging out with just the people we liked, especially since there were girls involved. Even if the place was a little bare bones, and some of us would end up sleeping on couches or air mattresses. That didn't matter so much, because of course, we all pitched on a couple of bottles and a few cases of beer, which we would be passing around the whole time. Tyler was initially apprehensive about having alcohol inside the condo, as he was worried about getting caught by his dad and not being allowed to party there ever again. Everybody convinced him it wasn't a big deal though, and to make it more tempting, since it was his condo, we let him drink as much as he wanted without having to pay his share. Admittedly, that was not a great idea, because for being the one who was nervous about it, Tyler drank more than any of us. Some of the guys gave him flack for it and said he was taking advantage of the fact that he didn't have to buy any of it. But then it was already too late, because a new kind of Tyler was unleashed, and he was just knocking back the drinks. I was his best friend, which made me feel like I had to keep up with him. None of us were experienced drinkers, so there were no thought about anyone staying at all sober to take care of the rest of us. By the time the sun set on the first evening, we were all wasted. The hours dragged on, the music kept blasting, and there were games played. Some people got sick, and some people were caught getting it on, but after a while, things started to die down. There was a point at which we were all winding down and all sitting around the living room, not really talking or doing anything. That's when Tyler jumped up out of nowhere and made a bunch of noise, trying to get us all hyped again. He kept saying stuff like, "It's only midnight, you quitters. The night is still young." And he was walking around to everybody, handing them drinks, all while he was slamming beers too. We were all pretty tired, so we didn't exactly respond to it, until he had a different idea. "Hey everyone, let's go to the beach," he shouted at the top of his lungs. I can hear those words ringing through my head to this day. It was such a bad idea. Still, and I don't know why, but as soon as he said it, we all agreed instantly and shot up to party again. We didn't want to get more drunk just to keep sitting around, but we were definitely down for something else to do. There was a brief moment where one of us mentioned that it was the middle of the night and nobody was supposed to go to the beach around then. But then that was answered with enthusiasm instead of deterring us. It was going to be so cool to have the beach to ourselves and be there at the wrong time of the day. There were so many of us together, what could go wrong? We killed the first bottle right then and there, and we each slammed another beer or two before heading out. We hadn't even changed out of our clothes into our bathing suits. It seemed like it was the perfect happenstance too, that the beach was right on our doorstep. We didn't even have to cross a single street to get there. That was the most dangerous part about being a bunch of drunk fools in the dark, I figured, so it was fine. Tyler was on a roll with the suggestions and said we should all go skinny dipping. Again, we all thought that was very exciting. Everybody had at least one other person there that they wanted to see naked, so it was a shame that it was a new moon and we could barely see anything. That made it less nerve-wracking though, so even if you were self-conscious, you couldn't get out of it really. Then, just like that, we all took off what little clothes we were wearing and left them in the sand before charging into the water. It was surprisingly cold for mid-March, but we were so drunk we had no problem powering through it. We waited out against the crashing waves until our feet weren't touching the ground. Tyler wanted to keep going, but the girls stopped because they were a lot shorter than us and were already treading water for a while. So of course, most of the guys stayed with them. Tyler, on the other hand, hadn't been hitting on any of them and was basically in his own world that sometimes had me involved in it, so he pressed on, breaking out into a full-on swim. I chased after him, trying to keep in my line of sight, but unfortunately, the waves were really high, even though they weren't breaking on us anymore. I started to feel sick from the motion, like I might throw up all my drinks straight into the ocean. That, and I was getting cold and tired. Eventually, I stopped and treaded water. I couldn't see Tyler anymore. I called his name, but there was no response. Not a shout back, not even splashing. I swam out a little further and I called his name again, as loud as I could, but still, just silence. My heart started pounding and I felt my throat closing up. I don't even know if it was the cold or just being scared of losing my friend, but it was probably a combination of both. I kept calling his name for a while until I eventually started to feel exhausted from treading water. Eventually I heard the rest of my friends calling out to us to come back. I was surprised how quiet they sounded, as I hadn't realized how far we swam out. Reluctantly, knowing I didn't have much energy left, I turned back and swam toward the sound of their voices until I could stand again. I was hoping beyond hope that Tyler was with them. In the darkness, I couldn't make out much detail, but I could tell they had all gotten cold or bored and were standing on the beach, waiting for us. As I dragged myself up to them, completely drained, my heart sank when I counted one less person than there should have been. "Where's Tyler?" I asked them right away. There was a short pause, and they all looked at each other with concern, then said they thought he was with me. In a last-ditch hope, I thought maybe he had gotten around all of us and was the first to get back to the pile of clothes and get dressed. We all ran over there and picked out our clothes, putting them on and seeing to our horror that Tyler's trunks were still there. I ran back to the ocean, but my friend stopped me from going back in, saying it was better to wait for him to come back. We shined lights out into the abyss and called his name 100 times, but we couldn't see or hear a damn thing. Not a single sign of him. After about 20 or 30 minutes, one of us had to make the call to 911. We were a petrified, shivering, sloppy mess. All of us. The cops asked us questions, but didn't suspect foul play. They said they would have to wait until daybreak to send a search party out into the water, but it never got to that point. While we were all standing there, Tyler's body washed ashore. In 2017, in my last semester of high school, some friends and I decided to skip the pep rally for the girls' varsity basketball team, making the playoffs for the first time. My last period of the day was theater tech. I was just taking it as a fine arts credit, and two friends of mine in the grade below me were in that class with me. We decided to skip the pep rally, leave school early, and go to the nearby Taco Bell like we did every day. However, administrators and security guards patrolled the parking lots to catch kids trying to skip, so we took a detour through the nature trail on campus in order to avoid them. Once in the nature trail, we came across this kid I hadn't seen before. He was a skinny white kid with shaggy black hair, wearing baggy jeans and a plain white t-shirt. He was shorter than me, but the most notable thing about him was his general look of dishevelment. His hair was wild and full of leaves and twigs, and his plain white t-shirt was dirty and the knees of his jeans were stained green and brown. He looked like he had been crawling around in the trail. I remember wondering if he lived there for a split second. When we came up upon him, we were walking in one direction, parallel to the school and to the back of the parking lot, and he was coming directly toward us. I knew the nature trail well enough to know that there was a bend that led deep into the woods, and I figured he had come from there. He was out of breath and he seemed scared. Weird. My two friends said hi to him, because my friends were in the grade below me and later told me that the kid was in their grade and with just acquaintances with my two friends. It was supposed to be just a quick hello, but I couldn't help but notice how scared he looked and how suspicious he seemed of us. He asked us what we were doing in the woods, and we told him we were skipping the pep rally. One of my friends asked, "What have you been doing out here? Camping?" Me and my other friend gave a nervous laugh, but the kid didn't crack a smile. He explained that he was dropped off at school that morning and was supposed to get on a bus to take him to DAEP, which is the alternative school that kids who got suspended from school went to. His plain outfit started to make sense now. It was the infamous uniform of the alternative school. He then explained that he didn't want to go to the alternative school, so when his mom dropped him off, he pretended like he would wait for the bus and then hide in the trail for the full 8 hours of the school day. He was still acting really skittish though, and without even looking at each other or speaking to each other, my friends and I could feel that something wasn't right with him, and that we were in some kind of danger. The kid looked around nervously often, as if seeing if someone might have followed us or if we were alone in the woods. Not long after this, we hit him with a, "Alright man, well, good luck. We're going to try to get to our cars and go home before the pep rally ends." When he heard the word cars, he perked up. He started walking with us towards the parking lot, continuing to talk. He becomes a lot more friendly and asks if we can give him a ride home. We give him some half-baked excuse as why we couldn't do that. We didn't expect him to ask that because I never met him and my friends barely knew him. But he really wasn't taking no for an answer. He tells us that people were going to start looking for him pretty soon, that he was going to be in a lot of trouble. We told him that he'd probably be fine hiding there in the woods, but he tells us, "Nah man, you don't understand. I broke into a car at the fellowship." He then pointed in the direction of the megachurch that had a parking lot that backed up to my school. I took this. From his waistband, he pulled out a handgun and I felt sick to my stomach. I had never seen a gun in real life before. At this point, I felt in danger. Not just because he pulled a gun. I had never really been scared of them. More so that the entire interaction felt uneasy, and that the guy was already unsettling and desperate. One of my friends very cautiously tells him that he should probably just ditch it and take off somewhere. He just stood there, staring at us for an uncomfortable amount of time. His eyes were meeting each of ours. I broke the silence by saying that we wouldn't tell anyone, but that we really had to go before the pep rally ended. And my other stupid-ass friend, who had been virtually silent the entire time, spoke up and said, "Yeah, and it's best we're not around if they start looking for you for that," gesturing to the handgun. His eyes narrowed, and once more he asked if one of us could take him home. This time it felt more like a command. I've never been a super brave person, but in that moment, I don't know why I just blurted out, "Nah man, I'm good." Again, there was an uncomfortable silence. Then he asked, "Before you leave, do you guys want to see something?" My first friend was kind of a hothead, and although he was uncomfortable with the situation, I don't think he was afraid of conflict. Nor was I, but my other friend, however, was not a fan of conflict and would always de-escalate first. We all looked at each other, and me and my first friend kind of had an unspoken understanding like, this is going to happen. If we have to run or fight, we might have to do it now. My other friend was very visibly afraid. He asked, "What do you want to show us?" And before the kid could answer, my first friend said, "We don't want to see. We have to go." My first friend started briskly walking past the kid, and me and the other friend quickly followed. Within a few steps, we just started sprinting towards the parking lot. I looked back once we were about 50 steps away, and he was still standing there watching us run. He had put the gun back in his waistband before taking a small adjacent trail back deeper into the woods. By the time we made it to the parking lot, there were police everywhere. We were sweating, out of breath, and terrified. They found the kid in the next 10 minutes or so. Somehow in the chaos, nobody saw us exit the nature trail and into the parking lot. But since there were so many cops in the parking lot, we decided to just head back inside through another side door to find that the door was locked. That's when an administrator had found us, brought us inside, and shoved us into a classroom where we were able to talk with others and find out exactly what was going on. This is what we could piece together from what we learned. Turns out that the kid had skipped DAEP, like he said, hidden the nature trail, broke into a car at the church, and stole a semi-automatic shotgun and a handgun from the car. After stealing the guns, he texted his girlfriend and he told her that he was about to do something really terrible and that when she saw his name on the news, she should turn off the TV. He told her explicitly how he was going to hurt some kids at the school. She knew he was supposed to be in class and was so worried about the text that she contacted the police. The school was put on lockdown until officers got a call from a guy at the church that 2 guns had been stolen from his car behind the school. And that's when they put 2 and 2 together and caught him hiding in the woods. I guess when he saw me and my 2 friends in the nature trail, he quickly hid the shotgun but didn't have time to hide the pistol, or maybe he didn't care enough to hide it. I was only 16 and in high school at the time of this story. It was just a regular day at school. I had finished my lunch and I was heading back to class when suddenly the intercom came to life. Attention, all students and staff, the principal's voice echoed through the cafeteria. We are now on lockdown. This is not a drill. Please remain in your classrooms until further notice. I felt a chill run down my spine as the chatter in the cafeteria turned into silence. Lockdowns weren't common at our school and I couldn't help but feel a sense of despair that was gnawing from the inside of me. I quickly gathered my things and I followed the students as we were being directed to hide in the gymnasium and in the school locker rooms. I checked my phone hoping for some news or updates, but the signal was weak and I couldn't get any information. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by screaming. My heart raced as I realized that the danger was closer than I had thought it was. I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from down the hall. My classmates and I huddled and we moved faster together, trying to remain as quiet as possible. We had no idea what was coming our way. The seconds ticked by slowly and we all tried to snugly fit together. It was so packed that it took like 5 minutes before I made the split decision. It was taking too long for all of us to fit through the gym and into the locker room as there was just so many of us. I decided to run through one of the open doors in the gym that led outside where the gym teacher was. I'm not sure what he was doing, but he didn't even try to chase me. I ran to the back of the school and through the soccer field, and I hid near the woods. I whipped my phone out and I attempted to call my mom, when suddenly I turned around after hearing, "What are you doing?" It was a familiar face. Tanner. I knew who he was, but not very well. He had been in some of my classes all through the school years growing up, and he was just staring at me with his menacing eyes and brandishing a weapon. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at him in horror. I couldn't even speak for a second. He had a handgun holstered to his hip and an M4 styled rifle equipped in his hands, and he was pointing it at me. "Hey man, don't do this," I said, pleading for help. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as he debated on blowing my head off. I stood up and faced him, in the heat of the moment practically thinking this might be the end, and my heart pounding in my chest. To my surprise, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. I knew I had to try and reason with him, to make him see that there was another way. "Man, you have to stop what you're doing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This doesn't have to end like this. Please think about what you are doing." To my relief, he actually lowered his weapon after about 5 minutes of pleading with him. And he weirdly broke down and started crying. I could see the desperation and pain in his eyes as he revealed he wanted the pain to end. Without warning, Tanner turned and left me alone, leaving me in a state of perpetual shock. I knew I had to do something though. I couldn't just sit there and wait for the worst to happen. I made a split-second decision again, and I decided to leave the school grounds completely. I could see the playground in the distance, so I ran towards it, hoping to find somewhere I felt more safe. I crouched behind a fence by the swings, trying to catch my breath, and while I figured out what to do next, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching and I knew I had to act fast. Peeking out from my hiding spot, I saw Robert. Oh man, it was nice to see him because he was one of my best friends at the time, and he said he saw me run out of the school when I did, and he ended up following me. He said he saw the whole thing where Tanner had me held at gunpoint, and he said he almost lost me trying to find me here. Tanner didn't go on to hurt anyone that day, unlike he planned. And surprisingly, he willingly let the officers arrest him. It's crazy how I had barely escaped a terrible outcome. I I ran home as fast as I could and told my mom everything while she hugged me and we cried. Tanner was a kid who had been bullied his whole life. That obviously doesn't give him the right to kill people, but man, something in our world needs to change. So I guess it's been about 9 years or so now, which seems pretty unbelievable to me. It's such a vivid memory that it almost seems fresh, but I think that may also be because I've repeated it so many times by now that I pretty much have an entire monologue memorized, recounting exactly what I experienced. Seems pretty weird to say it, but I was definitely lucky in some way. Luckier than most. I knew some kids that saw a lot more of what happened that day than I did. In my opinion, I've pretty much moved on from the shooting, and I haven't really suffered from any long-term emotional scars, but a few of those guys ended up pretty screwed up from it all. I know one girl who was super outgoing and smart before the shooting. She ended up dropping out of school our junior year because of a heroin problem, or that's the rumor at least. A few years ago, my sister found out that she had overdosed after she got out of rehab, leaving her 2 small kids with only their elderly grandparents left to raise them. Unfortunately, a seemingly large part of my former classmates have also struggled with severe emotional problems and depression, which definitely resulted from that day. Anyways, I guess I'll start this off like I always do. I remember it being one of the last few weeks of freshman year. It was cloudy, as it often is during the springtime in Oregon. What I remember thinking that was initially odd about that day is that it seemed much too warm for the sun to be hidden behind such a thick layer of clouds. It was hot, sticky, humid, and overall extremely uncomfortable. The high temperatures had forced almost all the students and teachers to the courtyard during passing time, 10 minutes between classes, in order to achieve some temporary relief from the stuffy, non-air-conditioned classrooms that we were stuck in all morning. I have 2 sisters. One is a year younger and still in middle school at the time. My older sister was a sophomore, but happened to be home with a stomach flu that entire week. Thank God. It was a Friday, and I remember everyone was really looking forward to our long Memorial Day weekend. My parents were supposed to take my sisters and I out for a weekend at a nearby resort in town, which is a popular thing to do among our community. I spent the entire time before school making plans with friends and chatting about the various 15-year-old shenanigans we would partake in. To say that our weekend plans had changed would be an understatement. I had PE first period that quarter, and we spent the time playing flag football out on the stadium turf behind the school. Since I had a free second, I volunteered to take the equipment back to the supply closet in the upstairs gym, while everyone else went to the locker rooms to get ready for their next classes. We had 2 gyms and locker rooms on the west side of the school, and a large enclosed courtyard separating them from the other classrooms and administration office. I had finished putting the cones, pennies, and whatnot in their place, and headed downstairs to the locker room, deciding to leave the supply closet open for the next gym period, which has turned out to be the single best decision I have ever made in my entire life. I had nearly gotten to the bottom of the stairs when I heard a loud pop, pop, pop. I stopped dead in my tracks as my mind tried to process the noise I just heard. My confusion turned to horror as I heard the screams and saw everyone left on the west side of campus sprinting down the hallways and through the closest door they could find and slamming them shut. I turned running back upstairs as fast as I could and heard 5 more gunshots by the time I got back to the closet, and I shut the door behind me. All I could do was sit in the corner and bury my head in my knees, sobbing. I heard 3 more scattered gunshots, then nothing. Nothing for what felt like an eternity. I can't even begin to describe how slow time was passing. I had absolutely no sense of time because my cell phone was still downstairs in the locker room, and there was no way in hell I was leaving the safe blackness of the supply closet. The worst part about hiding in the closet was not being able to talk to my mom and let her know I was okay. I just sat there and cried, praying and thanking any God who would listen to me that my sister was safe at home. I would have driven myself insane with worry if I was stuck alone in that closet and not knowing whether or not my sister was okay. I sat and waited for what felt like either was going to be my safety or my death. It seemed like hours before I heard the footsteps. There's no way to describe the feeling of being alone in total darkness, overwhelmed with this amount of fear. All of a sudden, I didn't feel like I was completely alone. I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up the stairs and into the gym, and then nothing. until I was startled to near death as one final pop radiated through the gym rafters. My ears rang as I attempted to accept my impending death, in the fetal position on the floor as footsteps headed slowly toward the closet door. I watched the strip of light under the door as a shadow of 2 feet blocked the light, and I was overcome with terror. I heard the doorknob shake aggressively, and I began to sob, thinking of losing the chance to see my family again, that my fate was stuck in the hands of an angry psychopath on a shooting spree, looking for the opportunity to execute me as I crouched helplessly in a dark and lonely closet. Before I knew it, the doorknob had been broken off. The next few moments are the most vague in my memory as a member of the SWAT team pulled me to my feet and ran with me by his side. It was so fast my feet barely felt the ground. He kept my head down, but that didn't hide everything. I saw so much blood under my feet on the pathways as the officer rushed me through my school courtyard and murder scene. I didn't know him, but I heard of him from my sister. He was a junior at the time and a very depressed and bitter boy. I guess he had few friends, if any, and always seemed to have a temper. She witnessed him one time throw desks and sometimes would have huge temper tantrums in the class when he didn't understand the material. From what I have been told, this is more or less what went down. As I was finishing up in the supply closet, there was an altercation in the courtyard involving the gunman. He had words with another student and pulled out his gun, shooting the other kid 3 times before opening fire on the crowd as chaos ensued following the first round. After fatally shooting both the student and a language arts teacher, he ran into the west wing of the school and hid underneath the bleachers in the downstairs gym for a while. After a while, his cover was blown, and he ran upstairs to the gym where I was followed by an officer, and then was shot and pronounced dead, which I didn't see, thank God. It was a pretty terrifying experience, and I suffered from a lot of anxiety for a while after this, but I've lived a pretty successful life since then. One thing I've taken away is that no matter where I am, I always make a point to eye the nearest escape and plan of action, just in case. This happened just a few days ago. For reference, I frequent a certain local alt hangout spot just about every night to have a few drinks and hang out with my crowd of regulars, who are almost like my family. Spring break for a lot of people was last week, which meant that a lot of old friends and former regulars came back to town and spent some nights at the bar like old times. Among this disparate group of people is a friend of mine whose identity I will protect by referring to them as Allison. Allison is very cute, but we were never that close and we never hooked up, so I'm courteously stuck in the friend zone, so to speak. Though that's not a problem for me, as I'm not interested in making things weird between us or forcing myself into a long-distance relationship. I can be a gentleman. Anyway, Allison likes to drink a lot. Most of us around this place have some kind of developing substance issue. Since she's a small, attractive female, all of her friends, myself included, make sure to look out for her when she gets drunk, just to make sure that nobody gets a chance to try anything nefarious. Recently, though, something despicable very nearly happened. It was the night of St. Patrick's Day, and I was very drunk and high after hanging out with my old friends who were in town. I had a blackout between 2 and 3 in the morning, but by 4, I was back in my body and sobering up. The only people still hanging out at the time were myself, Allison, a friend of mine, and the owner of the establishment. We bummed around for a while until about 5 when the owner finally kicked us out. That left just me, Allison, and our mutual friend in the parking lot. We were having our last little chat for the night and about to say goodbye when something very unexpected happened. Allison's ex-boyfriend Lily freaking appeared out of nowhere, just pulling up to the parking lot in the middle of the night. I hadn't seen him around all evening, and it's not uncommon for Allison to sleep in her car after everyone else leaves, so it was quite obvious to all 3 of us that he had come just to see her. I'll call him Josh. When he appeared, all 3 of us traded a look. I was immediately glad that I and my friend were still there, and that Josh hadn't successfully pulled up on Allison while she was alone. As if he had pulled up just a few minutes later, he would have been knocking on her car door in an otherwise completely empty parking lot. It's less important, but Josh is a little older and a cocaine addict, and wants Allison to be his little punk rock doll. They split months ago, the last time Allison left town, but Mance has been picking the scab the entire time. He won't just move on, you know? It's not like any of us hated him, it's just that he's not a good match, and everybody can see that except him. Of course, he started acting extremely clingy that night. We were all pretty much wasted except for him, and I could tell by the way he looked at us that he knew this. When he started to stand so close to Allison that she took steps away and tried to hug her for old time's sakes or whatever he said. I went back to the back door of the bar and tried to get the owner to come out to help survey the situation, but unfortunately the whole place was locked up and his car was gone already. By the time I got back, my old friend was saying goodbye. I dapped him up and I pulled him in a bit, trying to give him a look in the eyes that said, "Don't you dare leave," but he didn't get it. Then it was just me, Allison, and Josh. Allison tried to say goodnight and sleep in her car, but this was the moment that Josh had been waiting for since he saw the rest of us there. He said, "No, that's not safe. Let me just give you a ride home." I immediately tried to counteract this by saying how she's always done this and it's never been a problem, and how Allison had been talking about sleeping in her car for almost an hour and probably just wanted to follow through with what she had planned. But none of this worked. Josh was extremely pushy, and I never put my foot down hard enough. Eventually Allison caved and accepted the ride. We all said goodbye and got into our cars, then sat in the parking lot for a minute. The whole time I heard this voice in my head that told me not to let her get in the car with him. But I was so faded I could barely listen to it. However, I was still in the presence of mind to look out for my friend, despite how nervous I was about the situation. As they pulled out, I got in line behind them. We rolled through to the exit together, where we both should have turned right, but then Josh made a left turn. My heart jumped into my throat. I knew full well that Allison didn't live down that way, but it seemed like Josh was counting on me not knowing her well enough to be aware of that, but he was wrong. Took a deep breath and gave them about 5 seconds of follow distance, then made a left turn to follow them. I left plenty of room but made sure I could still see where they were going. I had to run 2 red lights just to not let them get too far ahead though, which made me worried that I was about to get pulled over or something. The longer it went on with them going the wrong way, the more sure I was that something was up. Eventually Josh made another left turn into a side street. I sped up and careened into the turn, knowing they could make another random turn and lose me, but I wasn't even sure if they were aware I was following them. As soon as I made the turn though, I swore I couldn't see them. There were no taillights on the road, but luckily there weren't too many other turns that they could have made. Luckily, just a few seconds later, as I was slowly rolling through the neighborhood, I saw Josh's car. They were parked on the side of the street with their lights already off. I swore again, with malice and anger this time, then pulled up in the spot right in front of his car. I left it running in park and quickly got out. I didn't even have a second to look out into their windshield, because they were both already getting out. It was a hectic few seconds that followed. Allison slammed the door behind her and ignored both of us completely, walking to my car with her arms crossed, jumping into my passenger seat and slamming the door too. The whole time Josh was yelling at her to come back. He even started to walk up to her, but I stopped him. I don't even think I said anything to him. I just gave him a look that told him to back off. He clenched his jaw in a way that made me tense up, expecting a sucker punch to come my way. But then he just pushed me back and muttered something venomous as he turned around and got back into his car. In that moment, actually, I was the most afraid, because in this country, somebody you're in a fight with, getting back into their car means 2 things. They're either backing off or grabbing their gun. I literally ran back into my car and sped off faster than I ever have in my life. Once I got back on the road, and on the way to Allison's house, I tried talking to her, but she was totally clammed up and curled into a ball in my passenger seat. The most I got was when I asked if I needed to call the police, and to that I got a very slight head shake to indicate no. When we were passing the bar, she finally spoke, asking me to not drop her off at home and let her sleep in her car. I obliged, figuring she probably didn't want to interact with her parents. I helped her in and made sure it was locked up. Then I sat in my car and watched over her until sunrise, when other cars finally started pulling in. The next day, she was back at the bar and trying her best to act normal. When I got her inside, I asked her about it again and double-checked if I should have called the cops. She again said no, but this time added that it was only because I got there when I did. My heart sank when she said that, and I told her she should at least tell a few close friends about this, to which she agreed. Now, Josh is basically the same on-site order as a neo-Nazi. We may not be the best group of our friends on account of how we enable each other's self-destructive habits, but god damn it, when it comes to certain things, we look out for each other. An assault of this sort is something you're lucky to just get beaten for.
A couple of years ago, I worked at a gas station. It was a pretty small town, about 2 hours north of where I was from. I was living there temporarily while I worked on flipping the house I owned. I worked on the house during the day, and I would work at the gas station on nights to help pay for it. The gas station was right off of a major freeway, and we would get lots of people passing through town. One night, I was working a 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift. I didn't mind these shifts because they would not be very busy, and I always found things to do. Most of the time, I would be the only one working for a majority of the shift. On this night, there was a decent amount of people coming through for the first few hours, and at about 1 a.m., things really started to quiet down. I mopped the floors and then went back behind the counter. Then, I noticed a car pulling into the station. It was a regular black car and looked pretty normal, except for when it got closer I noticed that it had no license plates on it. The car drove very slowly around the front and then went to the side of the building where I could no longer see it. About 5 minutes passed, and then a man came inside who I assume was the driver of the car. He was a very tall man, about 6.5 feet tall, and pretty thin. He was wearing a black sweater and gray pants. He had a very serious look on his face. He walked in the front door and looked directly at me. The counter was on the other end of the store, so he was probably about 40 feet away. He didn't say anything and just looked at me. Eventually, I couldn't take the awkwardness, and I said hello to him and waved. He responded by turning and walking to the other side of the store. He just stood there, no longer looking at me, but looking at the wall or whatever items were for sale in that area. I was pretty confused at this time, and I was getting kind of creeped out by this guy. Eventually, he walked into the bathroom, which was at the end of the store. About 10 minutes passed, and he remained in there. Another customer finally pulled into the gas station and got some fuel and came inside to pay. I was so relieved by them finally being a normal customer. I almost wanted to bring up the man in the conversation with them because it was so strange, but I felt it wouldn't be professional, so I didn't. The customer left, and I once again felt pretty creeped out knowing this guy was still in the bathroom. A long hour went by, and we didn't get any customers. The man didn't come out of the bathroom either. I felt it had been long enough, and I decided to walk over to the bathroom. It was a bathroom with 2 stalls in it, so I could just walk in to wash my hands or something, and it wouldn't seem weird. I got to the bathroom and opened the door. I saw that the lights were out, and it was pitch black in there. I reached around for the light, but when I found it, I saw that it was already switched on. This freaked me out. I thought about just leaving, but I decided to turn on the flashlight to my phone to look around. When I did, I looked in the first stall, and it was empty. Then, I saw the second one. I could see the man's legs from the bottom of the stall. Then I shined my light up to see the man's head poking out from above the stall, staring directly at me with the creepiest smile I have ever seen. I dropped my phone as soon as I saw him. I picked it up as quick as I could and then ran for the bathroom door. I got out there, and the man did not come out and follow me. I went back to the counter and debated what I should do for a few minutes. I really did not want to go back in there, but I also didn't want the man scaring customers that went to the bathroom, and I felt that it was my responsibility to keep the place safe. As much as I didn't want to, I decided to go back and tell the man he would have to leave. I walked back to the bathroom and opened the door. I shouted to the man that he needed to leave, but there was no response. I can't say that I was surprised. I decided to just put an out of order sign on the door because of him and the light not working. Several hours went by and I only got a few customers. Amazingly, the man never left the bathroom. Finally, at 4 a.m., my coworker Devin came in and we worked together for the final hour of my shift. I felt much safer and I told him what had happened. We decided to go into the bathroom together to see what the man was still doing in there. We walked in with our flashlights shining, but when we got inside, we saw that both stalls were empty. Not a trace of the man at all. I have no idea how the man was able to leave without me seeing him. Thinking about it still freaks me out. 2 years ago, I had a problem with the tires of my car. My car was fairly new and reliable, but over time the tires started to get a ton of wear on them, and I found out that I needed them replaced. One day when I was out, I happened to be shopping at the Walmart near my house. I was in sort of the corner of the store, and I noticed that they had an auto center there. The auto center was at the very far back corner, and I had never really noticed it before, but I decided to give it a look and see how much their tires were and what kinds they had. As I walked into the area, I could see that nobody else was really over there. I walked over to the desk that they had to see if anybody was working there that I could talk to. There was nobody there though, and when I looked around the auto center, it didn't really look like it was used much anymore and seemed pretty outdated. After a minute or so, I decided to just look at the tire information that they did have and then just leave. The next day, however, as I got home from work and got my mail, I saw that in my mail there was a postcard from the Walmart Auto Center. It was basically just an advertisement to go, and I found it a funny coincidence how I had just been there the day before. But the next day, I got the same thing in the mail once again. It was the exact same postcard, and now it went from a funny coincidence to a bit strange. I took it inside and threw it away. The very next day, I got one again, and the day after that, and the day after that. I was getting the same exact flyer from the Walmart Auto Center every single day as part of my mail. I decided that this was fishy enough, so I drove back to the same Walmart to try to see what was going on. I took a handful of the flyers that I received and went to the same auto department that I had been to before. This time, there was actually someone working there. A man was behind the counter, and I showed him the flyers and told him my situation. He looked at them and said that he didn't know why I kept getting them, and basically didn't have an explanation for me. However, he pointed out to me that none of the postcards had actually been addressed to me, and showed me a large stack of them that they had near the counter. When I saw this, it made me realize that whoever was giving me these postcards was not actually sending them to me, but physically putting them in my mailbox every day. I went back home after that, and decided I would try to keep a lookout of my mailbox to see who was doing this. The first 2 days, I once again got more flyers, but failed to see who did it. But the next morning, I was up early at about 6 a.m. It was before the sun had risen, and I just happened to be looking out of my window. When I did, I saw a man slowly walking down the side of the street. My eyes locked onto him when I noticed him walking closer to my mailbox. Then, I saw him reach into the pocket of his jacket and place something in my mailbox. I had finally seen who did it, but right after he did, I noticed him look to my window and then look directly at me. I didn't know what to do when I saw this, but before I could think of anything, the man started sprinting up my yard and towards my house. He ran all the way to the front door and tried to open it. Luckily, it was locked, and I watched him run away. I thought he was leaving, but a couple of moments later, I heard the sound of the back door to my house trying to be opened. That's when I decided to call the police. Clearly, somebody was trying to break into my house. When I had called 911, I told them what was going on and started to walk into my bedroom. But as I was on my way there, and literally right after I hung up the phone, I heard the sound of glass breaking. That's when I decided to run into my bathroom instead and lock the door. I didn't hear any noises though after the breaking of glass. I was thinking maybe the man never did enter my house and had just left. I waited and waited in my bathroom for what felt like forever, not hearing anything and waiting for the police to arrive. I couldn't take it anymore, and I finally decided to leave the bathroom and walk out. but as soon as I did, I saw the man standing inside my house about 10 feet away from me, smiling. It was the creepiest thing I had ever seen. The man was wearing a jacket with the hood up, and I couldn't really tell much details of his face, other than he looked like a pretty average guy. I ran back inside the bathroom and locked the door quickly. Thankfully, at around the same time, I started to hear the sirens. The man never did try to enter the bathroom, and the police showed up only to find the man completely gone. They looked around my property and neighborhood, but never found him. After that, I never got anything else strange in the mail, and I never saw the man again, but sometimes I worry he will return. I also wonder what he was doing, if he had seen me at the Walmart and decided to randomly stalk me or what, but I'm glad I've never seen him again.
Last year, I really needed a new laptop. I used a computer daily for college and work occasionally as well. It was something that I really needed in my daily life. The one I had though was old and really slow, and I had been saving up to buy a new one for a while. My sister suggested that I look on Facebook Marketplace, and so one night I went out and searched laptops. I was looking for a newer and more powerful one, and after several days of searching and a lot of research, I found a listing of one that seemed to be a really good deal. I did some more quick research on it and decided it was the best option for me. I then reached out to the seller. The seller responded to me pretty quickly. His name was Brian, and when I contacted him, he told me he could meet up with me the next afternoon when he got off of work. I told him I was willing to buy the laptop at the time, as long as it worked good, and I would pay the full price he was asking for it, which was $800 cash. I knew that was significantly less money than it costed brand new in the stores, and I felt like I was going to get a really good deal. Brian told me that worked fine, and we agreed to meeting up the next day when he got off of work. There was a little shopping area in the town that I lived in, and we decided to meet in the parking lot of the place. It was usually pretty busy, and we drove into one of the back corners of the parking lot that was a more quiet area. My sister decided to go with me so I wasn't alone, and we drove to the location right on time. It was 2 p.m, and I think we got there maybe a couple of minutes early. Then we waited. I had messaged Brian telling him when I was leaving, and he told me he was leaving as well. When he wasn't there yet, I figured he was on his way, or maybe he got held up at work. My sister and I both sat in the car waiting and just talked as we did. Eventually, time went by, and we started to get concerned. Nobody was near us in the quiet area of the parking lot where we agreed to meet, and Brian was now more than 10 minutes late. I messaged Brian telling him exactly where I was and the car that I was in, and asked where he was. We kept waiting, and he didn't respond. Pretty soon it was almost 30 minutes past our meeting time. I then looked and saw that Brian had read my message that I had sent to him, but he never responded. My sister and I left, feeling frustrated that the guy never showed up. My sister thought maybe he realized the laptop he was selling was worth a lot more than the asking price, or something like that. We both drove back home, which was our parents' house that we lived in while we were away from college. Our parents were both at work, so it was just us there for the time. After we got home, I once again went back onto Facebook Marketplace, but it appeared as though I had been blocked by Brian, and everything was deleted. This made me angry to see, and after that, I decided to search for more laptops and kind of start over. I was in my bedroom when suddenly I heard my sister come running in. She told me she heard a noise coming from the back window and then saw a guy out there. We both walked out, and almost as soon as we did, we heard the sound of our back door being opened. It was only 3 o'clock, and our parents usually didn't arrive home until after 5. We knew it was probably the guy my sister had seen. We both ran back into my room and shut the door. We pressed our heads up against the door and listened. Somebody was now walking through our house. My bedroom was at the end of the hallway, and the man was not all that far away. I asked my sister what we should do. She said she was going to call the police and took out her phone, but just as she did, we heard the footsteps headed towards us. We got as quiet as we could. My sister wasn't able to place the call to the police yet because we were afraid to make any kind of noises. We heard whoever was there walk slowly into the hallway and then into a bedroom. My sister said it sounded like he was in her room now. I then got an idea. I said that we had to get out of there, and I pointed to my window. I then ran over to it, and as quietly as I could, started to open it. The house only had 1 level, so as long as we could get out there, we would be able to get away. I opened up the window, and as I did, it suddenly made a loud noise. Just then, we heard the guy start to leave my sister's room and come down the hall towards my bedroom. I jumped out the window, followed by my sister, and as she was climbing out, I heard my bedroom door open. We both ran out the yard and down to the neighbors across the street who we knew really well. Luckily, they were home, and we waited in their garage as we called the police. When the police got there, the man was still in our house, and they caught him in our basement. He turned out to be the same man named Brian that was going to sell me a laptop. He had never met with us, but was in the same shopping center parking lot when we were there. He was just parked next to all the other cars. He then followed us home without us knowing and attempted to break into our house, possibly for the cash I had to buy the laptop. At least that's my best guess of his reasons. Either way, I won't use Facebook Marketplace again.
This happened to me during my senior year of high school. It was the spring semester, and I had taken an elective class called Speed and Agility Development. I was an athlete in high school, so this sounded like a fun and easy class to take. Basically what we would do every day is sprinting drills and stuff, and sometimes play games. We would do something different almost every day, and the teacher, Mr. Johnson, would mix it up a lot. I remember one day, Mr. Johnson told us we were going to take a hike off campus. Our high school was a little bit out in the country, and across the street from the school in the back, there was a large woods with some hiking paths on it. When class started, we met up in the gym, but then walked outside and crossed the street to start the path in the woods. Mr. Johnson said we would jog along part of the trail and hike the rest of it. Then he took off running. There's about 15 kids in the class or so, I would say, and we all started running following his lead. I decided to hang back with a couple of my friends in the class, and we ran in the back. We let ourselves fall kind of far behind, and the deeper we got into the woods, the thicker it was, and the path became more and more narrow. As I was running, my shoe suddenly came untied, and I stopped to tie it. The friends I was with offered to stop, but I told them I'd catch right back up to them. I took maybe 30 seconds, and then continued with the jog. I didn't hear anybody else anymore, though. I started to run faster to try to catch back up with the group, but shortly after that, I came up to a stop on the trail that led to 3 different paths. I didn't know which way the rest of the class had gone, so I went with the one in the middle. I started running on it quickly until I was almost out of breath, but saw no sign of anyone. I ran back to where the paths separated again, and this time went a different way. By this point, I was so far behind I had no idea where anyone else was. I jogged along another path for a while, and thought I heard someone, so I began to run faster to catch up with the group. I kept running through the thick woods until I could hear I was closer. Once I thought I could hear the class again, I slowed back up. I saw someone, and that made me feel a lot better, until I got closer. I realized the person I was seeing wasn't in my class. Somebody was walking off the path in the woods to my left, but they looked like a grown man. I was sort of far away, and all I could see between the thick tree branches everywhere was that the man had long black hair and a green shirt. As I got closer, he suddenly stopped and turned around and looked at me. I thought about waving to him or saying hi, but the man instead started running deeper into the woods after he had noticed me. I thought it was strange, but more importantly, I realized that I was now lost in the woods. I didn't have my phone with me because Mr. Johnson never let us bring them to class. I thought maybe the man that I had seen in the woods would know how to get out of here, so I yelled hey to him to see if he would come back. He didn't answer me though, and by this time he was way deeper in the woods. I kept walking, and I figured I would eventually get out of there. I would say like 2 or 3 minutes later though, as I was walking, I started to hear somebody walking behind me just off the path in the woods. I stopped and looked behind me. I didn't see anybody at first, but then just barely could see the man in the green shirt. He was behind a larger tree, and I just barely saw him, but he was there. He wasn't walking now, and I could tell he was trying to hide from me. I turned back, and I just kept continuing on with the way that I had been going. I heard the man walking behind me once more as I did. He was slowly getting closer and closer to me. It was starting to creep me out, so finally, I turned around and looked again. This time, I caught the man as he was nearly on the path, and I watched him duck back behind more trees. I said hi to the man, but in as friendly of a tone as I could. Then I asked the man if he knew how to get out of those woods. The man didn't answer me, or even make any sound at first. Then, without warning, he charged out from his hiding place and started running at me with a crazed look in his eyes. I turned and ran, which was the only thing I could think to do. I was running as fast as I could through the woods and then down the path with the man hot on my heels. It didn't take long for me to realize that I was faster than the man, but not by a lot. He was pretty quick, and I was sprinting, and when the path would come to multiple different paths, I would choose one at the last second to try to throw the guy off who was chasing me. Eventually, I took a sharp turn to the left. I briefly went through some thick brush and woods, and then back onto another path. The man seemed to go into a different direction, and then he seemed to stop where he was. I continued quietly down the path that I was on. I thought I had finally lost the guy. However, when I turned the corner, I saw the path was leading me right up to a pond. There was a very small dock on it, and thick woods surrounded the pond by all directions. I then heard noises in the woods coming closer. It had to be the man again. Sure enough, I saw him walking at a fast pace towards me. He was coming at an angle to the right, and without hesitation, I sprinted back to the left down the opposite way of the path that I was on. I kept running and running, going back down each way that I had already gone, hoping I would eventually find a way out. I heard the man running behind me almost the whole way. I kept on running, and eventually I stopped hearing the man so closely. My running slowed down to a more manageable jog, and I kept going. I was going back down every path I had been on, and finally I saw an opening of the path. I had made it back to where we had originally started the hike as a class. I didn't know what time it was or where the rest of the class was, but I decided to just go back to the school anyways. I made it back, and within maybe 10 minutes, I saw the rest of the class coming. I ran to my friends, and it turns out nobody really noticed I was gone besides the couple of friends I had been with. They just assumed I ditched class. And whoever that guy was after me for some reason.
I was staying at a cabin in Canada. It's a family-owned lodge, nothing too big or fancy, just something my grandparents built and kept up with. So every now and again, someone in the family would enjoy a getaway there. This was just after the new year. I planned to stay 3 nights at the cabin. It was out in the middle of nowhere on some off-the-grid property that I had to get to by snowmobile, which was normal around this time of year. When I got there, I fired up the wood heater and set up my stuff in the bedroom. Within just 30 minutes, I started to feel the sense of relief that I was hoping for. Time felt to move slower out here, and there was nothing to crowd my mind with. I could just lay back and enjoy the peace and quiet. The rest of that day and night was nice. I got up in the morning at sunrise, making breakfast on top of the wood stove. Then I bundled up to head outside and grab more wood. When I opened the front door, I was taken aback. There were footprints in the snow, coming right up to the cabin. I immediately stepped outside and looked around. Then I followed them for a while. They led into the woods, with no signs of going toward the road, which was several miles away. How could they be way out here and not have taken a snowmobile? And why were they out here to begin with? I was really confused, especially with them having to have come up to the cabin during the middle of the night. Otherwise, I would have heard them in the morning. I got wood from the shed and brought it inside. I debated leaving, but I figured if they came by and didn't do anything, then it must have been an accident. Not to mention how much of a hassle it was to get to and from the cabin. It just would have made this trip a huge waste to leave now. I sat by the fire and just kept a lookout for the next couple hours. I didn't see anything. As the sun got higher and the temperature got warmer, I threw my jacket back on and wanted to go for a walk in the woods to pass the time. I decided I might as well take the opportunity to see if the footprints led anywhere. Maybe I'd find another cabin or something, which would put my mind at ease. I followed them into the woods. I walked for probably 20 minutes, not passing any signs of anything. It was just one continuous trail of prints in the snow going through the woods, until I suddenly heard something ahead of me. I whipped my head up and looked ahead. It was suddenly quiet and everything was still, just endless trees and snow. I knew what I heard was the crunch of a footstep. There was no mistaking it. I felt goosebumps all over my body, as I knew someone was out there in front of me, having to be hiding behind one of the trees. They probably just noticed me and quickly hid, maybe 10 or 15 feet from where I was. "Hello? Is someone out there?" There was no response, not even the slightest sound. As the tension grew, I felt like I had to do something. I decided to turn around and run back to the cabin. I packed everything as quickly as I could, locked up the cabin, and took the snowmobile back to the road. I don't know what happened at that cabin, or what was going to happen, but I have no doubt that that person in the woods was the same person who came by in the middle of the night. Them being on the way back to my cabin only shows that it was no accident. I haven't been back to the cabin after that. Every year around the end of February, me and my good friend Justin take a camping trip to the same place. We both did a lot of backpacking and camping, but there was always something different and nice about camping in a snowy forest. With the right gear, it wasn't all that unsafe either. This year, we got there and set up our tents, built up a campfire, and enjoyed a couple drinks around the flames. It wasn't really that long after we got there that we suddenly heard something horrifying. It was this dark scream in the distance, echoing across the landscape. It only lasted a few seconds, then it went quiet again. Both of us jumped up from our chairs though, startled by it. It sounded too far for us to even have a chance at seeing who it was, but we looked in that direction anyway. Justin seemed to think that it had to be an animal just making an eerily human sound, because there was no way someone else was out here. I was pretty sure it had to be a person, but either way, we didn't really know what to do about it, other than wait and see if we heard it again. A while passed, and nothing else came. The sun started to set, and the temperature started dropping. We grabbed some more wood to put into the fire, and made food. But then, again, out of nowhere, that scream sounded. It was closer, like maybe only 200 feet away from where our camp was. Justin and I looked at each other, both thinking that we should probably check it out before the sun was fully set. I grabbed my knife just in case, and we both bundled up and headed into the woods. We tried to walk cautiously, unsure what exactly we were walking up on. We had maybe gotten 150 feet out, when we heard it one more time from almost right next to us. I stopped and stared in that direction, but there was nothing there. I glanced at Justin, and he seemed as worried as I was. We must have stood still and waited there for nearly 5 minutes before Justin started slowly stepping forward again. He passed a few trees when he suddenly stopped, and I could sense the fear through his body language. I stepped up next to him, and I almost threw up. There was a deer carcass laying in the snow, definitely having been put down recently. Then I felt Justin's hand tap on my shoulder. I lifted my gaze up, and standing across the forest, there was a person. He was just standing there, wearing hardly any winter clothing, and he was watching us, almost like he was observing us. Justin tapped on my shoulder harder, and I understood what he meant. Both of us left and hurried back to our camp. We didn't even speak as we packed our things in a rush and got out of the area. I don't think there's an explanation for what we saw, or who that was out there, or even if that was the person we heard screaming. After that, we stopped going to our camping spot and settled on a different area, hoping to never come across something like that again. It was the day before Christmas Eve. I had hopped in my car to do a few DoorDash deliveries, hoping the holiday season would bring in some better tips. It was around 11 p.m. when I got this order. It was a normal one, just a bag of food to drop off at their house. Most of my previous orders were actually grocery deliveries, probably because stores would be closing up for the next 2 days. The address on this one was far though, farther than I'd usually be willing to drive, but with not many other orders coming through, I took it anyway. It was lightly snowing outside, and the roads were very quiet, making the drive peaceful. The house was not in an average neighborhood though. When I pulled up to what I thought was going to be the entrance to the neighborhood, it was actually just a thin path through the trees, with a small cabin-looking home at the end. I pulled down and parked, getting out with the food. I walked up to the door and gave it a few knocks. Inside, I could hear chatter, like a group of people laughing and talking over each other. It sounded like so many people, I was actually confused on how they could all fit in such a small cabin. There was also something strange about the way it sounded that just didn't seem right. Something was off. Then the door opened. A man stood in front of me, and the contrast to what I expected had me put off for a second. The inside of the house was still, motionless. Nobody was running around, and most of the lights weren't even on. And yet, the sound of a huge holiday party was coming from the small room at the end of the hallway. The man smiled at me. "Why don't you come bring the food inside? They'll be happy to see you." That was an odd thing to say. I began stuttering, trying to say no and make up an excuse, but the man interrupted. "They just want to thank you for working during the holidays. You'll be glad you stopped by." All the while he was saying these strange and honestly creepy things, the chatter in the back of the cabin continued, until it suddenly cut out. Just like that, the cabin was quiet. It was like a recording or tape had stopped playing. The man looked back for a moment, clearly not expecting that to happen, and before he could do anything, I dropped the bag on the porch and ran back to my car. I got in and drove away. I stopped doing deliveries for the night and just stayed home for the rest of the holidays. I know nothing actually happened at that cabin, but it's how disturbingly strange everything was, and the thought of what could have happened that still freaks me out. It was the day after Christmas, and I worked at a small family-owned grocery store as an overnight stalker. I'm not even sure why I was scheduled this night, because we were closed for Christmas, and it was probably really slow during the day, so there wasn't much for me to do as far as stalking. I spent the first hour filling what little needed to be filled on the shelves, but then I kinda just wandered around. As I was walking past the front of the store, I noticed a person outside, unusually close to the building for this time of night. It looked like he was just walking around, but he quickly noticed me looking at him, and instead of going away, he came closer to the window. He didn't say anything or try knocking, he just stared at me. I felt really uneasy and wasn't sure what to do. After a few seconds of him not looking away, I turned and walked away from the window. I guess I was just trying to play it off, like I wasn't bothered. That was very strange though, like no normal person acts like that. I waited a few minutes before going back to the front of the store and looking out the window. He was gone. I sighed in relief, then continued walking around the store to pass the time. I was just weaving in and out of the aisles, fixing up some of the shelves. Maybe 10 minutes had passed when I rounded the corner at the end of one of the aisles and immediately stopped walking. There were several boxes that had fallen off the shelves and were scattered on the floor. They weren't small things either that could have just tipped over. They had to have been knocked down or moved by someone. Just as I was trying to process it, I heard something from down the aisle. A soft but deep and eerie laugh, like a man quietly laughing right around the end of the aisle. It almost sounded unnatural, like a grown adult giggling like a child. Part of me thought about going to confront him, but when I remembered the man I saw by the window, they were fairly big and could have had something hidden in their jacket. I ran to the front and out the doors, getting in my car and calling the police. They pulled in 10 minutes later, and the man inside the store was gone. We later got hold of the security tapes and saw him find a way in through a side door, and as he hid behind the aisle, laughing at me, he held a knife in his hand, some kind of small switchblade. Cops think he wasn't sober, and I don't disagree, but I also don't think it changes anything. I could have died that night if things had gone any differently. It was New Year's Eve. I was never a big party person, but on big nights like these, I almost always got peer pressured into going out. This year, my friend was hosting a party at his place. He was kind of known as the rich friend because he had a big house with land and everything. My buddy Trav picked me up around 9 and we drove to the party. There were maybe 20 or 30 people there. Nothing too crazy, but enough to get me drinking more than I should have. We played some drinking games and watched the ball drop, and overall, it was a good time. Around 3 a.m. though, I was ready to leave, but I found Trav passed out on a bed upstairs. Figuring he, and probably nobody else here, was sober enough to drive, I went outside and ordered an Uber. It said they were 10 minutes away, so I sat down on the curb at the end of the driveway and waited. His house wasn't really near any big roads. It was kind of away from everything. Nice and quiet, which was good for me to relax after a night like that. I just sat there and curled up under my jacket and waited for the ride for what felt like only 4 or 5 minutes when a car pulled up. "Uber?" the guy called out. I jumped up and got in, kind of startled by how I'd lost track of time like that. I guess I really was wasted. I got settled in the back seat and he started driving. The man looked like he was 50-ish, with short dark hair and a thick beard. "Big party tonight?" he asked. "Oh, yeah, I guess so," I responded, though I wasn't much in the mood for small talk. He glanced at me in the mirror, and something about the look he gave me just made me uncomfortable. I really don't know why. At the time, I thought I was just overthinking it. I put my head back and closed my eyes, trying to rest for the remainder of the ride. But only a minute later, my phone dinged. I opened my eyes, immediately making eye contact with the driver in the mirror. He was already looking at me. I awkwardly glanced away and pulled my phone out. My stomach tightened and my face went pale. It was a message from the Uber app, a text saying the driver just arrived at the pickup location, and a following text from the driver asking where I was. I looked back up at the mirror. The man's eyes were locked on me. I put my phone back in my pocket, leaned my head back, and closed my eyes again. Inside, I was freaking out and terrified, but I tried to play it off like I didn't know anything. 30 seconds later, I felt the car slowing down, and when I peeked out the window, I saw we were at an intersection with a red light. As soon as the car stopped, I opened the door and jumped out. Midway through getting out, he started driving, which made me fall on the pavement, but I got up and sprinted away. He drove off after that. I don't know who that man was, but seemingly he was going around on New Year's night and picking up random drunk people waiting for Ubers. There were so many signs I missed, like the fact we weren't even going in the direction of my home. I was just too out of it to think straight. Honestly, I never even should have gotten in the car without checking my phone. Where he would have taken me and what would have happened is unknown.